Hey there guys, so today we're going to be taking a look at the GMKtec M5. This is a system that is rocking an AMD Ryzen 7 5700U. That's right, that is a Zen 2 based APU on a system being sold in 2024. Immediately, I know a lot of people are going to be like, why the heck is any company still selling brand new systems that are rocking Zen 2 based APUs? And I would be inclined to agree with you if it wasn't for the fact that these systems are still so aggressively priced and there is no other competitors at this price point when it comes to giving you a good level of price to performance. On the Intel side of things, this price point is still filled with nothing but Celeron level CPUs. So we're talking about N95s, N100s, N200s, and even going higher end than this, at price points that are higher than this, we're still seeing systems with the N301, which while that is 8 cores similar to this, that's only 8 cores, which means no hyper-threading, and we're getting Skylake levels of IPC, as opposed to this, which is Zen 2, so it has higher IPC than that, and you actually get SMT, so it's not just 8 cores, it's 8 cores, 16 threads, and we can actually have 32 gigabytes of dual channel memory in here instead of being forced to only have single channel. Now we are starting to see systems with 12th gen and 13th gen core processors start to get close to this price point, but they're still not really competitive at a price to performance ratio, and especially at the efficiency that a system like this has. Unfortunately for GMKtec, there is a significant amount of competition within this price category, specifically because of the fact that there are so many systems with Zen 2 and Zen 3 based APUs. So GMKtec does need to actually do something to differentiate this system, and I'm going to tell you right now the biggest differentiating factors here. First and foremost, the biggest thing is the fact that this system actually has 2.5 gigabit networking, and not just 2.5 gigabit networking, you get two 2.5 gigabit Ethernet jacks. Now, if hearing that means absolutely nothing to you, you don't really see what the benefit of that is, then this is not a system for you. I'm just going to say that right now. This is not the system for you. Now, if you heard the fact that it has two 2.5 gigabit NICs and that got you excited, then this is pretty much the system for you. You pretty much know or don't know, and if you know, then this is actually going to be a fantastic deal. Because when it comes to mini PCs, dual 2.5 gigabit NICs is something that's mostly been relegated to higher end systems that still don't exactly come with great levels of performance. B-Link has some systems that actually come with dual 2.5 gigabit NICs, but they're rocking Intel processors that are noticeably worse than this. Even though they're newer chips, it doesn't matter if they're at a performance tier that is meant to be below the level of performance that this has. So the biggest benefits here is the fact that we get those 8 Zen 2 cores with 16 threads. We can have 32 gigabytes or even 64 gigabytes of dual channel RAM, and those dual NICs pretty much means that you could turn this into a fantastic mini home server. There are a lot of people out there that use Intel NUCs or mini PCs in general for self-hosting, and the fact that this has those dual 2.5 gigabit NICs means that you can actually do a home router on a system like this that actually is smaller than most routers that your company will end up giving you. I could pretty much stack up 2 of these on their side and it would not be as big as the router that my ISP gave me. Now, of course, that's a Wi-Fi enabled router, so it has both a Wi-Fi access point and the actual router portion built into it. So you would need a separate access point if you want to use this thing as a router. But that, of course, could just be positioned wherever you want it to be. It doesn't have to be on all in one unit. And overall, you're going to get better coverage. You're going to have way more control over your networking. And if you're someone that actually likes to self-host a lot of services, you probably have realized it is a huge pain to actually deal with the built-in interface for most of these all-in-one routers that these ISPs give you. I know the web UI for my router is atrocious, and trying to do anything requires a long wait time in between clicking anything. That could be completely avoided by using a system like this and installing OpenSense or pfSense, whatever it is that you're willing to use here. I'm more of a fan of OpenSense just because I prefer things that are completely open open source, but it's hard to deny the stability that has come with a service like pfSense. And if you're curious where the performance of a system like this actually stacks up, well, we could look at the numbers. Now, it's important to talk about TDP in this situation. If you don't know what TDP is or what it stands for, TDP essentially stands for thermal design power. And without getting too in depth, essentially what that means is it is what the maximum amount of power that the system is allowed to utilize, or rather the chip in this system is allowed to utilize. Now, it's not exactly a one-to-one translation. For example, a TDP of 30 watts does not mean that the system is pulling only 30 watts from the wall. There's obviously going to be some overhead because of the fact that it's not just the APU itself that is using up power. The motherboard itself there is inefficiencies that come with power supplies in general. And in general, there is a wide assortment of different things that are going to require power. For example, you plug in a keyboard and a mouse. Well, those things aren't just magically powered by the air itself. It needs electricity. Same with pretty much anything that you plug in here that is going to need USB power. But essentially what TDP is going to actually affect is the level of performance that you're going to get when you're actually using the APU in this system. By default, in the BIOS, the TDP is set to 15 watts. That is the balanced profile. There are 3 profiles. There is the power saver ultra low wattage preset that sets a TDP of 10 watts. There's the balance preset that goes for a target of 15 watts, and then there is the high performance preset that goes for a target of 35 watts. There's some pretty drastic differences there. Now, the jump from 10 watts to 15 watts is not really dramatic at all. We're only looking at a 5-watt difference. But going from the balance preset of 15 watts up to the high performance of 35 watts is a significant jump in power usage, but it does also come with a pretty significant increase in terms of performance. But there is a major cost to all of this. There is a major cost in terms of heat, because obviously the more power you're using, the hotter your system is going to run. But also conversely, the system is going to be noticeably louder because the fan needs to work significantly harder to try to dissipate all of that heat. And the chassis itself does not really seem to be designed to handle that 35 watt TDP all that well. At 35 watts, just playing a game for even just 10 minutes gets this thing to screeching levels, and already I keep a relatively cool temperature in my room, at least for where I live in Texas. But you raise that TDP up to 35 watts and already I'm starting to get into the 80 degrees, even though I have a relatively cool room of around 71 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 21.6 degrees Celsius. If you're in a hotter climate than this, that means that your system is now going to be pushing into the mid 80s, maybe even going up to the 90s, which means you're now going to be thermal throttling, and that's going to affect your performance. And if you're going to sit down and just play a game for an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, you're going to be hitting some pretty hot temperatures, and honestly, the system is screeching at you so much that you're not really going to have a great time. But this is not a gaming system. Before we even look at gaming numbers, which again, this is not a gaming system, but I will show you what the iGPU in here can do, since this is rocking a Vega-based iGPU that at this point did get an update at the start of January, but I doubt it came with any actual optimizations. But before we actually look at the gaming performance, let's take a look at what the CPU can do. At the stock 15 watt TDP in Cinebench R23, we do actually end up getting a multi-core score of 6,420. Now, that's not exactly a remarkable result, and it actually does end up giving us a multi-core score that is lower than a 25-watt Ryzen 5 5500U, that being a 6-core 12-thread Zen 2-based APU. But of course, at 15 watts for the TDP, this system is only using 27 watts at the wall with the CPU fully loaded. And our single-core performance actually does end up being higher than a Ryzen 5 5500U at 25 watts, because we get a single core performance of 1,256, giving us a pretty solid around 100 extra on the single core score versus the 5500U. That means that in day-to-day tasks, the 5700U is technically faster, though it is pretty much going to be indistinguishable. But of course, this is extremely efficient, and you do get 8 cores, which means that you can spread workloads across multiple cores, especially if you're doing any kind of self-hosting and things like that that might not need the fastest cores ever, but having their own dedicated cores will keep things from getting cluttered. Of course, if we do raise the TDP all the way up to 35 watts, then we do actually end up seeing an increase in the multi-core performance, now getting a score of 9,093. That's a pretty significant jump in performance, pretty much around a 2,500 score increase. Of course, the single core performance pretty much ends up being identical, which is what you would expect. But that does mean that at 35 watts, it is a lot closer to the score that we get with a Ryzen 7 6800U, though of course still falling behind in single core performance there. Overall though, it's decent enough results, and it's really just having access to a wide assortment of cores that makes this a compelling option, especially at the 35 watt TDP, though this system again is just screeching at you at that TDP, so I would really recommend just keeping it at 25 watts, though it does call into question if something with this many cores at that low of a TDP is really worthwhile. You really have to think about the workload that you're going to be using. If you're going to be using this as a home server, which I think is its most ideal usage, then you actually do get a pretty compelling package here, even at that low TDP, because at least from what I have found over the years is that when it comes to self-hosting, especially if you want to be able to run things in VMs, cores are king, even if they're going to be running at such a low TDP. And by the way, at a TDP of 35 watts, we actually do end up seeing around 50 watts being used from the wall. So a pretty noticeable increase in wattage as you would expect, but of course with a pretty massive increase in performance. But that really is only going to matter in those multi-threaded workloads that are really going to be pushing the APU here. So I think 15 watts is still the most ideal option. But now let's jump in and actually take a look at gaming performance. So I decided to take a look at some games running on this system that I actually have been playing recently. So obviously the first game that I took a look at on here was Helldivers 2. Of course, none of my friends were available to play at this time, so I was just doing a solo mission. And it was decent enough in the sense that at least a 30 FPS average with the lowest in-game graphics settings and using FSR with the performance preset did net us at least a 30 FPS average, with consistently being above that, but those 1% lows are pretty brutal, and as you can tell by the frame times, there is consistent stutter that happens throughout the entirety of the gaming experience. And this is already a relatively easy mission, so I'm not exactly getting hounded by about a half dozen chargers and have 3 bile titans just vomiting all over me. So that is to say that if you're actually going to be playing the game with some friends, you're really going to be in for a rough time on here. And it really seems like these Zen 2 based APUs, due to the fact that they are still rocking Vega graphics, it really makes it an overall rough gaming experience, at least in a lot of modern titles. Though there have been some pretty drastic changes that have happened in games recently that have made things kind of rough overall for these Vega based iGPUs. A game I've been playing a lot recently is actually Age of Wonders 4, and this is a 4X strategy game that has combat that is based around being essentially a turn-based tactical game. So you get this overworld here where the FPS doesn't really matter too much. The 1% lows certainly aren't great, but the fact that at least we're getting a 30 FPS average means that this is at least doable, and because it is turn-based, having an actual high FPS really doesn't matter as much. It certainly doesn't feel smooth to play like this, but I feel like if I needed to actually play this game, and by needed to I meant I had a friend or just someone that wanted to play and this was the only system that I had available to me at the time, well, I think I'd be able to play perfectly fine. So if you're on a laptop that has this chip and this is the only way you can play, you're at least going to be able to do it, at least when it comes to the overworld. Things really start to get rough though when we start to get into the combat. There's a lot of activity that happens in the combat, and here already this isn't even a huge fight. I'm not going up against a full army where a full battle will have essentially 18 units on each side. Here I do have a practically full army just going up against 2 enemies, and already the performance here isn't great. Our FPS average is in the 20s, with our 1% lows being in the single digits, and as you can tell by those frame times, doing practically anything really starts to bog things down. Again, it is a turn-based game, So it's not unplayable just based off of those numbers, but this certainly doesn't feel great to play. If this is your only way to play a game like this, you could probably get away with this, but it certainly doesn't feel remarkable. That being said, growing up, I would play first-person shooters at this frame rate because I had an absolute potato of a computer, and those are still some of the most fond gaming memories that I have. So I could be a lot more forgiving, especially for a turn-based game like this. When it comes to this level of performance, just know that this is not remarkable because, again, we are running this at the lowest in-game graphics settings already, and it's pretty rough. But I would actually still consider this to be playable because, again, if this was the only system that I had, I would stomach playing the game like this, and I would more than likely have a fantastic time. So this is one of those titles where you don't really need to get too bogged down when it comes to the numbers. That said, though, where this system really shines is just these older titles, AAA titles like Alien Isolation here, which, to be fair, is at this point a decade old, but it still looks really great, and it's still a fantastic game to play, especially if you're a huge fan of the Alien franchise. And while it's one of the best running AAA games that I've ever played, especially for visually looking really, really nice, at this point it is pretty dated, but it does show that a lot of the AAA titles of this era will run perfectly fine on a chip like this, though you'd hope so considering the fact that the chip here is being put into brand new systems being sold in 2024, but again, the chip is at this point almost 5 years old. It really calls into question whether or not Vega-based iGPUs are worth getting at this time, but it's really hard to find anything else at this price range that competes like this because at the end of the day, this is still a AAA game from a decade ago, yes, but it's running extremely well here at the ultra graphics settings. But as you've probably been noticing throughout the testing here, the temperatures that we're reaching are starting to get pretty noticeably bad. Now, the system is set to its high performance setting, which is 35 watts, which is extremely high for a system like this because this system is noticeably loud right now. And you'll see that just through benchmark runs, where the game is pretty much just running for around 2 minutes at a time, and after multiple runs, we're looking at about 6 to 8 minutes in total of the game running, and already we're reaching temperatures in the 80 degrees. Now keep in mind that my room is at 71 degrees right now, and that is Fahrenheit. So that would be around 21.6 degrees Celsius. That means that if you're in a hotter climate than me, which I know a lot of people are, you're going to be in thermal throttling territory. And that's actually going to introduce some pretty noticeable problems while you're gaming. Of course, if you're looking to play lighter titles like Valorant, this isn't really going to be a problem because here the system is still set to 35 watts, but as you can see, we're using about 15 watts. That's because the game just really is not that demanding at all. If you look at our GPU clock, sometimes it'll drop down because of the fact that it is really not all that demanding on here, though the performance isn't great in terms of the 1% lows. It's certainly not where I would want it to be. In general, the game does not feel all that great to play because of that inconsistency, and it really seems to carry over through a lot of this. After playing a few rounds in the game, things never really seem to have leveled off. I was hoping that the 1% lows over time would actually end up improving to the point where it stops being such a disaster, but unfortunately that doesn't really seem to be the case as the 1% lows still consistently fell below 60. It's not the most ideal scenario, but people have definitely played this game through worse. But where it really starts to get bad is when we're looking at CS2 at this point. The CS2 update really seemed to have brought a lot of performance issues when it comes to this extremely low-end hardware. Hardware that used to actually be able to run CSGO does not seem to be able to keep up with CS2. Specifically, the 1% lows is where I see the biggest struggle here, and it all overall leads to a very inconsistent experience that just does not feel great to play. And it's very disappointing to see because this was a title that actually used to run pretty well on hardware like this. You certainly were never going to be able to get a high FPS, but the 1% lows used to be significantly more consistent here. And again, we're not using the full 35 watts. We're more in the 20 watt range because the GPU is already reaching its max clock most of the time, and it's really those CPU clock speeds that actually end up being the limiting factor here. In general, though, it's just not a great experience, and it's really disappointing to see that this is the direction that a title that for the last decade has been extremely well supported on these APUs just get to the point where it is locking out a significant amount of users out there from actually continuing to play this game. But really, a large amount of titles out there are going to push the power usage all the way up to its maximum 35 watt TDP, and here with Mountain Blade Bannerlord, you could see that again we are in that 30 to 35 watt range where things actually start to get pretty rough. At least in terms of temperature, the performance that we actually get out of this is really great. But what takes away a lot of it is the fact that the system is now next to me just screeching as this is running. It's not great in that aspect, though the level of performance that it actually gives you is really decent. But again, look at those temperatures. If you are in a hotter climate than me, you're already getting dangerously close to thermal throttling territory, and that's really going to bring down your gaming experience. You're mostly going to notice it with very inconsistent frame times. So keep that in mind. Do keep in mind though that the system does come with the TDP set to a default of 15 watts as I mentioned before. And if you try to game like that, you're definitely going to be seeing a drop in overall performance, though depending on the type of title that you're trying to play, it might not be as drastic. As you can see here with Alien Isolation, at 15 watts, we're still getting pretty decent performance. We're not getting close to that 60 FPS average that we were practically at before, but it's still very nice levels of performance that we're getting here. And if you look at those temperatures, they're significantly lower, and the system is so much quieter next to me that it is no longer irritating. It is no longer a problem. This is pretty much the ideal level of noise that you would want out of a system like this. I really wish that instead of 35 watts, they would have just set it to 25 watts, even if we would have sacrificed a little bit of performance. Being able to have that nice balance of performance and sound would have been ideal instead of how it is now, where you could either choose for it to be quieter but have a noticeably lower level of performance, or have it absolutely screech at you but you maximize what you can get out of your chip. It's really not the most ideal configuration. And while Alien Isolation held up pretty well, Tiny Tina's Wonderland here at the 15 watt TDP does actually see a pretty massive drop in performance, where by raising the TDP from 15 watts to 35 watts, we actually see around a 45% increase in performance. That's a pretty massive deficit here. And while at the 15 watt TDP, this is still pretty playable. We're talking about around a 30 FPS average versus what was closer to around a 45 FPS average. And while 15 FPS might not seem that drastic to you, at this low of an FPS, it actually makes a pretty massive difference, especially because our 1% lows are at the edge of being acceptable, which means that in scenarios where you're actually playing the game and things are getting very hectic, those 1% lows can actually start to struggle. Now, if you're looking to play indie games or just extremely old titles and things like that, the 15 watt TDP will actually hold up perfectly fine. And if you're trying to do emulation, I would recommend just sticking to 15 watts. But okay, so we see this system is not exactly a gaming system. It can actually do gaming in a lot of titles out there. There is a huge library of games that you're going to be able to play on a system like this, even at its default 15 watts, which I would recommend sticking to if you can help it. But really, it's not a gaming system, and it's not really being pushed as a gaming system. Its biggest selling point is the fact that it actually has those dual 2.5 gigabit NICs. You can make a really nice home server with a system like this if you just want some services running. If you're looking to do a lot of self-hosting, you can get a lot done with a system like this. You have easy accessibility to the expansion on here. You can throw in a 2 terabyte or a 4 terabyte SSD, and you could use a system like this to self-host whatever it is that you really want, because there are people out there that are running home servers with Xeons from Sandy Bridge and Haswell era to this day, and they're running a bunch of different services. The IPC of Zen 2 still holds up in 2024 when it comes to services like that. My own home NAS that I use to store all of my files runs on an i5 6600K that is just downclocked, or rather is TDP limited down from 95 watts to just 65 watts. And that's more than adequate for running Image, for running a Palworld server, for running a Valheim server, and for running a Nextcloud installation. And I still have more than enough headroom to really actually run more services on there. The system is not even getting remotely close to fully loaded unless things are getting hectic in Palworld. It does seem like Palworld eats up a lot of memory, so if you're looking to self-host servers for games and stuff like that, I would recommend getting a system that has 32 gigabytes of RAM. I know that 16 gigabytes might seem appealing. You might think that you won't need 32 gigabytes. If you're looking to run services, you're going to need 32 gigabytes of RAM. Luckily, the configuration that I got did come with 32 gigabytes of RAM. I really think that we are at the point now where 16 gigabytes is just not worth getting anymore. 32 is the way to go. It's not really that much more expensive, and a lot of the times the 32 gigabyte configurations will actually come with even more storage, so there's hardly any downside whatsoever to getting the higher end configurations. Now, where does this stand in comparison to everything else that's available? Well, the closest thing to this is really like the Boss Game P1, which does have 2.5 gigabit, but it is only one NIC. And of course, there is the Sur 5 Pro that comes with the same 5700U as the P1 and the M5 here, but you only get the 1 gigabit NIC, though the system does tend to go on sale for cheaper than this. In general, I think that B-Link and really their parent company AZW in general, for all of their systems, they tend to do better in terms of TDP configuration, and their systems seem to run quieter. And that's something that I actually really value a lot. But the benefit that GMKtec has here is the fact that they are extremely easy to open up and upgrade, and those dual 2.5 gigabit NICs actually make this a very, very compelling box for the size. Because a lot of the times for mini PCs that have configurations like that, you're looking at more like getting an Intel system, and it's going to be a low-end Intel system. Think systems that have Celeron type of processors. Now, Celeron as a name has been dropped by Intel, and they pretty much just go by the generic Intel processor name, but think things like the N95, N100, N200, and the N301. All of those are about as cheap as it gets when you're looking at getting 2.5 gigabit. That's really the biggest selling point of a system like this. It is that you get that networking at a very reasonable price, and you're not sacrificing the performance here, where instead of being stuck with 4 E-cores from Intel, where you're looking at more like Skylake levels of IPC, now you have Zen 2 here, which is higher IPC, you get more cores, and they're still insanely efficient, so you're not even really sacrificing all that much more in terms of power usage. And since these are monolithic die APUs, you're not really looking at the same level of idle power problems that you'll see with desktop Ryzen chips, where since they have an IO die, the idle power consumption of those systems actually tends to be higher than Intel systems. That is not the case with these APUs. Their idle power usage is insanely low, and even fully loaded, these things are not exactly guzzling down wattage like Intel systems are, and you're still getting really great performance. So do I recommend the M5? Well, if the networking really matters to you and you're looking at doing a self-hosted server, or you need a streaming PC or anything like that, then this is actually a pretty compelling option. But really, it's just that networking that is the selling point here. If you just care about getting the APU that is in there, there are cheaper systems and there are better systems that will give you that. And if you don't need the dual NICs, then I would recommend the Boss Game P1 over this, because you still get 2.5 gigabit. You don't get the second NIC. If you don't need it, then it's not really that big of a deal, and you get a overall quieter system that actually has a better TDP configuration out of the box than what this has, because at 35 watts, this thing screeches. At 15 watts, it's great, but things like the Sur 5 and the P1, well, I mean, those systems also have a TDP of 35 watts, but they don't screech at you the way that this does. I really wish that GMKtec had nailed it when it came to that TDP. If they had done it, then this would have been a top recommendation from me, but it is that noise at the 35 watt TDP that makes it a tough sell unless you are looking specifically to run this at 15 watts, which is extremely efficient and really, really great for a home server. but you still get a large amount of cores, you get great networking, and very nice ease of access to get in here. And personally, I'm a fan of the design of the system in general, and I am a huge fan of the green buttons on there, and I'm glad that GMKtec is sticking with the green buttons. So overall, it is a conditional recommendation, not an overall recommendation, so definitely think about what kind of system you are looking for and what you need out of it, because this might not be the right system for you, but for others it might just be the absolute perfect system. I'm going to leave a link down below a few systems that I recommend over this, and I am going to leave a link to this if you actually need something that has 2.5 gigabit networking. Let me know what you think down below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.